The faculty, staff, and students of St. Bonaventure University present Sunrise, a New Era for Media and Politics, a podcast focused on today's dynamic political landscape.
Welcome to Sunrise, a series of podcasts on the changing dynamics of media and politics. My name is Rich Lee. I'm a professor in the Giandoli School of Communication at St. Bonaventure University. I'm also the executive director of the Giandoli Institute. This is the third and final segment in the series, and I'm very happy to have with me Mary Rose Cabell, chair of the Political Science Department, Andrew McGurl, journalism student, and Don Gillian, the associate professor here in the Giandoli School. I've been ending the first two by making everyone a meteorologist for a minute or two and asking them if you had to use a weather term to talk about the state or the future of media and politics, what would you use? I'm going to flip the script a bit and maybe start off with that question and see where we go from there. So, Mary Rose, you'll be up first.
I think there's some storm clouds, there's some bright spots, and there's a storm heading our way, but it might be diverted, who knows?
Well, I think uncertain is good. I don't know if it would work for weather report, but it works for our purposes.
Well, people want certainty, but
Yeah.
I don't trust the weather report.
Andrew, you're going to have to deal with the future of all this more than the trailers. I mean, how do you look at what's down the road?
I hate to give the same answer, but I see a lot of uncertainty. There are so many bright spots, so many new avenues that media is going in these days, especially subscriber-funded media. But also there's a lot of bad in that same avenue. So it's really hard to tell.
Okay, it's interesting that you mentioned the bright spots first, because I think for the most part, people have been uncertain, cloudy. Can you talk about what makes you optimistic for the future?
Yeah, there are a lot of outlets that I follow. Breaking Points for one, a few others that make most of their money through subscriber donations and payment plans. And I see that as a very positive direction, breaking away from a lot of the advertiser and corporate media control that CNN, ABC, all of them have to deal with. That's kind of the brightest spots that I see.
Okay. And Don, you've been in this business a long time, as I have. What do you see coming down the pipe?
I think I would term it a seasonal wintry mix, the kind of thing that if you're inside can be fun to watch and isn't particularly surprising, but if you're driving in it can be a challenge and kind of miserable.
Good. Maybe you have a second career as a meteorologist. I think it was the first one, I was cloudy because of, or was uncertain. The second one, I was a little bit more optimistic. I said partly sunny. We'll see where I come down at the end of the show today. So one of the things that drove the podcast, we're looking at a shift in the way people get news and information, that legacy media is losing its influence. And we can talk about whether or not we think that's a valid assumption. But Mary Rose, we'll start with you as a political scientist, talk about what this means for the type of candidates coming down the road. And I just wanted to reference an article I read recently about Jack Schlossberg, the grandson of John F. Kennedy, who's thinking about, or actually making a run for Congress in New York, and a longtime Congressman Jerry Nadler, who's vacating that seat, said his successor should be someone with a record of public service, a record of public accomplishment, and he doesn't have one. But do you think someone with a good social media presence can knock off someone who's got the public policy credentials?
I think it's. I've been thinking about this. I think it's all context. I've already gotten texts from Jack asking for my money. So he's got some reach. But I think it's yes and no, right? When you have the Kennedy's legacy, it's more than just social media, right? So he's got more than one thing going for him. But I was actually, when you sent us the initial questions, I was thinking more of the primary with Adelita Grijalva, because she was up against a Gen Z Deja Fox who was backed by David Hogg, who had a massive social media reach. And I was listening to Grijalva interviewed on a podcast, and she was basically asked about this. You sort of criticized for your lack of sort of social media reach, and she sort of laughed. She said, "Well, I let my daughter and her friends do my social media, and they had, probably something on the order of tens of thousands of followers, compared to, Fox, who had orders of magnitude more. But she had a ground game, right? She had name recognition." So I think social media alone, without a ground game, because people will point to Mamdani, but he used social media very well to boost his ground game. So I think just social media in a vacuum, with no record, is not a recipe for a success. But I think it can help candidates who, in past media environments, wouldn't have stood a chance. Like Mamdani in the old media environment of even the 90s, would have really never gone.
Yeah, I think you make some good points there. I mean, everybody looked at Mamdani and kind of painted him as he's the guy using social media, using TikTok, and he did, but there was some substance,
Oh, he's like, we're going to knock on 1 million doors, and they did, so like he had a solid ground game that he coordinated the social media and the ground game really, really well.
Yeah, I'd like to get Andrew's perspective on that. Do you think we mischaracterize young voters, saying all they care about is what's on TikTok, these flashy videos, and that, you're not that interested in public policy?
I'd say absolutely. I think that's a grave mischaracterization. As was just mentioned with Zohran's campaign, a lot has been said about he won because of his social media presence, which I think is missing the point entirely. For people my age especially, the 18 to 29 male demographic, he performed exceptionally well. And I think that's a reflection of his policy where instead of pandering like a lot of candidates have done recently, I think of Ruben Gallego and his big truck ad that was essentially dumbing the American population down, saying, oh, we're going to get you the biggest trucks now. People are really sick and tired of that sort of pandering, and effective communication from a candidate is the best way to court support. And I think talking about the real issues, child care, cost of living, those are the big issues that people care, especially in my generation, about the most.
Yeah, I think it seems to have resonated. And I think, there were candidates who did traditional retail politics with good ground games, and that worked for them. So I think we're going to probably have a mix of both going forward. But, Don, for someone who's a journalist, teaches journalism, how do we cover, candidates these days if they're not going to be doing as much of traditional politics, going to the festivals and the fairs and kissing babies, and instead they're just posting videos online?
Well, I think what's been said thus far about the ground game argues against the premise of your question.
Yeah.
They're still going to be going to the fairs. They're still going to be kissing babies. They've got to get out there and talk to real people. To the extent they don't, and rely simply on social media, I think Andrew's right.
Yeah.
That's a shallow approach that increasingly people who are fluent in social media will recognize and see through. Social media is an element of a campaign, and if we're honest, as you go up the ladder of influence with politics, the further away from people you get, the higher up the ladder, the less interaction you have with real people. To the point, our presidential campaigns now do not interact with real people.
Right.
To the extent they do, it's large rallies. And even those are relatively self-selected. So, on the national scale, it's to some extent largely a fiction. As you go down closer to local, it's increasingly important. But I don't think you're going to see the ground game disappear entirely. I think social media is simply another element of the media, and candidates haven't been engaging with traditional media for a long, long time. I mean, it started before Clinton, but Clinton is really the break where, he started, you've mentioned, he went on late night television, so they that trend has been with us for a long time. And let's be honest, they candidates don't see traditional reporters as any kind of ally. Usually, there are some exceptions, but if they can get their message to people outside of traditional media, they're absolutely going to do it. They'd be crazy if they didn't.
Yeah, I mean, there's, as I pointed out, they have two benefits. One, they reach people who don't follow politics closely, who watch these entertainment shows, and they're not undergoing the scrutiny of a political journalist. They're talking to a talk show host. And some do ask some tough questions, but I think most of them are softballs. That's why they prefer to go on there, which kind of maybe leads me to my next question, which is, you have this trends we saw in the last election, and I think our goal is we want to make sure we have an informed and educated electorate, and we may not have it now. People may not be as informed and as educated as we want. I think there's a danger that more of that's going to happen, and I was reminded of a quote by Adlai Stevenson, which I looked up before that. In one of his unsuccessful runs for the presidency, he gave a speech. Somebody was all hyped up about it, and it said, every thinking voter is going to vote for you. And he said, that's not enough. I need the majority. So, Don, let me stay with you. From a media standpoint, what can we do to make sure, we can put the stories out there, but are people going to read them and take the time to read a long form, story, or are they going to watch a 30-second video clip?
That's a different question.
Okay.
The premise of your setup was we want, and I question the we. Who is the we? Because there have been low information voters since the beginning of the country. The question of how do existing media do what they do in a changing technological landscape is somewhat different. And I think the reality of the landscape we're in at the moment is quality journalism may not get all of the views, but chances are it will be refracted through a series of reinterpretations and end up being consumed by the voters from a variety of different sources. So from my perspective, and it doesn't matter whether you're with the New York Times or you're at a small subscription service or you're doing a local blog, I think the important thing is thinking through, writing well, asking significant questions, and once that is out into the consumable cyber space, if you will, when it's picked up, it will be refracted and consumed.
Okay, I want to go back to the first part of your answer. Are you questioning whether or not we, whoever we is, want an informed and educated electorate?
Well, there are always elements of the political class who benefit from an uneducated electorate. You can quibble over the definition of educated. Trump, I think, famously said, "I love the uneducated." He was saying something rather narrow and specific there. I think that has been taken out of context for political reasons itself. But, the reality is low information voters are arguably easier to manipulate, particularly right before an election. And in a political atmosphere where things are so close, things are so balkanized, that you have very, very loyal Democrats, very, very loyal Republicans, there's very little crossover in between, that to the extent those in-between voters are not engaged, not plugged in, low information, yeah, there's an advantage from a political standpoint of maybe being able to tip them one way or another right before an election, because many of them don't actually engage until maybe a week before, if you're lucky. But I wouldn't make too much of that. Most of the American electorate has a pretty good idea of who they're voting for before they arrive at the ballot box.
Yeah, more so today than...
I will note, though, the people who are determining elections tend to be the ones that haven't actually engaged significantly or haven't made up their minds until right before they walk in the ballot into the polling station.
Mary Rose, I'm interested in your thoughts on Don's comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the research in political science does show that low information voters are the ones most susceptible to sort of these traditional media effects like framing and priming. But I think the bigger concern, and one I imagine Ben us last week, is the fragmentation of the audiences. We're not even all getting the same message. We're not even all getting the same basic facts. And there's a lot of, I'm really concerned about the mis and disinformation out there that keeps getting reported. I mean, like I had a student saying, you know, Mom Donnie was out there calling for global jihad, which has been debunked, right? But, and I don't, I mean, this is a relatively well-informed individual, actually, right? Who obviously has a partisan viewpoint, but I don't think would be intentionally, spreading wrong information. So, I mean, even pretty sophisticated audiences are, right, falling into that trap of confirmation bias. And it's hard. So, like, even well-informed voters have a challenge in terms of figuring out what messaging is valid messaging and what messaging is not valid messaging. So I think that's a real concern, especially when we have, I mean, it's great. I mean, I listen to lots of podcasts and I, find them a lot more satisfying than news sources that I used to go to. And I still do, check out, but less and less. Yeah, it's hard, like it's harder and harder to know this is really good. I mean, there's something too. I mean, we don't want professional journalists to gatekeep too much, but if something's in the New York Times, I know the New York Times hires a lot of lawyers, and I know their journalists are trained in ways to vet sources. So, yeah.
You looked like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I chafe a bit at. Your analysis is a common analysis, but I chafe a bit because it assumes a very particular point of view, and that particular point of view tends to be an academic, elitist point of view. And we want, there's always this undefined we want a certain type of voter. And I think that is historically a product of the kind of media environment we had in the last 50 years, which was primarily a monopolistic environment, where you had media gatekeepers. And I think we have a generation or two who are very accustomed to looking at the media environment and seeing this roughly the same thing everywhere they look, and being very, very unsettled when today they realize that the majority of the students in their class do not go to traditional media outlets, websites, do not tune into traditional newscasts on television, and it's deeply unsettling and disturbing. And what kind of voters are we fostering? And I think it's the wrong interpretation. I think. And historically, it's not unusual. At the beginning of this country, the media environment was incredibly fragmented. It was explicitly political, and that's essentially what we're kind of returning to, I think. And low information voters, misinformation, disinformation are not new things. They're being deployed in new ways, but they're not new. I think. Really what the focus should be is fostering a sense of critical thinking amongst regular people, and that's an element, frankly, of public schools, who, in my opinion, have dropped the ball and have dropped the ball for a couple of generations running.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you. You see students coming into college who are bright, but sometimes they don't have those critical thinking theories. They don't have background in civics, and
we stopped teaching civics 30 years ago.
Yeah, and they don't, have the background in reading newspapers, legacy media. But let me turn to Andrew, who's part of that generation. How do you feel, coming into college? Are you prepared for this field?
I felt very prepared. I went to a very classical Catholic school back in Minnesota. Civics classes in middle school, all through high school, reading the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, all that stuff. I feel, I would say, almost uniquely prepared for college. I know a lot of people, and especially you add in COVID and online school to the mix. I was graduated before then, so I had a little bit better of a footing entering college. But I did want to return broadly to the general point about the fragmentation of media today, where you can see a lot of upsides and downsides in it. I think predominantly the fear is just the prevalence of disinformation. You have the racist videos of people angry about Snap that Fox News was even putting out that were generated by people on Twitter with Sora AI, and it throws Sora into the mix. There's just so many avenues for disinformation that reaches what I think are new levels. We used to not have presidential candidates saying Haitians are eating cats and dogs on debate stages. I feel like that's a new thing. But then when it comes to the plus sides, traditional media is not in a good spot either. You have Barry Weiss as the Minister of Truth now, and all these media organizations they are also doing just as much dis and misinformation as independent people on social media are. So again, coming back to that whole uncertain point, there's so many directions that things can go in that I don't think there's a way to make a very sure proclamation about what's going to happen.
I have to push back on the Barry Weiss Minister of Truth bit, in part because Barry Weiss is seen as a minister of truth because Barry Weiss comes from a conservative standpoint. And in a media landscape, national media landscape that is, I'm sorry, predominantly biased toward a liberal viewpoint, someone as, quite frankly, milquetoast as Barry Weiss is seen as some sort of hobgoblin because she is sort of conservative. Barry Weiss does not, by any stretch of the imagination, equate with Nick Fuentes, who is also now part of the fragmented media landscape. And the fragmentation alone, the country was able to function and trundle along with an outrageously fragmented media landscape prior to World War II. I have some faith that we will be able to do it again, but I think you're absolutely right in terms of the unprecedented advent of video deepfakes. That is an experiential new ground that I don't think anyone, particularly Americans, are at all prepared for.
Yeah. I want to get back to misinformation, disinformation, and I think we've talked about how there's an incentive for the people who do that to have people uninformed. Is there a flip side to that? Is there an incentive to stop that? And I think you said, maybe it has to start in high school or below, but, how do we...
Yeah, well, I would agree with the critical thinking piece, although I would disagree to a certain extent. I mean, I've been teaching at Bonaventure for 25 years now. I find my students today are as critically thinking as they were, if not more than they were 25 years ago. So I think to a certain extent, perhaps that, I don't think you certainly can't blame the educators. Their hands are tied. It's the politicians, right? And the standardized testing, they're being forced to teach to tests, the kind of metrics that we're using. So I would not put this on educators. But I find that my students, even ones coming from public schools, are quite capable of critical thinking. Obviously, there are ones who've chosen to go on to college, but I think that's the kind of, we need to give them the sort of tools to evaluate. Is this likely a deep fake? What do we look for? What kind of tools can we use to analyze this? That's certainly going to be important. Obviously, education and defunding education is probably not the way to go, which seems to be what's happening right now.
Well, I mean, Andrew certainly is an example of someone who kind of knows the playing field. And, I think I know you pretty well since you came to Bonaventure. You were with us in Oxford. But how typical are you among your peers?
I think fairly typical.
Okay.
Sorry. At least in terms of the people I spend the most time with, there is a general feeling among people my age, people with my general interests, so that's a little bit of a selection bias. But in terms, there are a good amount of people my age that are very concerned about these sorts of things, and want to think critically and do think critically. There is, of course, a big issue. You look at just how prevalent is Andrew Tate, how prevalent is Nick Fuentes, how prevalent is Candace Owens, all these, like, that, forgive me, but insane things that people my age eat up, which think it really does speak to some sort of issue that needs to be corrected, but what precisely that is and how exactly to do that, I don't know.
I saw you shaking your head as Andrew was answering.
Oh yeah, no, he is not representative of the student body as a whole. Now, granted, you're a senior. You have the advantage of at least several years of college education over many of your peers in my class. But he is within the top tier of students in terms of, knowledge, being able to process the knowledge, engagement. He's a different sort than the average Bonaventure student. And I think that was true when you arrived in Bonaventure, I would guess. And I think it probably has something to do with your education at the high school level. And I think if you're going to point the finger anywhere other than high school teachers, I think it needs to be pointed at parents rather than politicians. And education really begins at home. And that's where I think the interest in figuring out if it's real or not, if it's good for society or not, if it's fair to other people, does it exhibit any sort of sympathy or empathy, those sorts of basic human concerns, Franciscan values, if you will, really start at home.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. It's been a great discussion. Like all of our other podcasts, we could have gone on for a while, but I want to thank you, Mary Rose, Andrew, and Don. You've been watching Sunrise podcast for the Jandoli Institute. Thank you for watching. There are 2 other segments on. You can watch them at jandoli.net. Thank you, everyone, for watching.